All right, this is a story with a character named Living Jones in it. And it was Living Jones. There's hundreds of Living Jones stories in North Florida. This is one of my favorites. It came from my great grandmother, and my great grandmother and her family lived in a place called Maxville, Florida. And I've got the map up to show you. It's I grew up in a little town called McClenny, Florida, and we're about 30 miles from Jacksonville. Maxville is kind of in between Jacksonville and McClenny. It's just a little hole in the road. Not many people lived there. It was really country, uh, farming area, and just a railroad track that ran through the Maxville. So the story takes place in Maxville. My great grandmother was just a little girl. Her daddy was a guy named Doc Wilkerson. And this is her when she was a little baby. This would have been right after, this would have been the 1860s, 1870s. This is her stepmother, Eliza Wilkerson, and her mother had died in childbirth, and her daddy remarried this woman, Eliza Wilkerson. This is my grandmother as an old woman. This is the way I remember her back in the 1960s. Everybody loved her. She was. This is one of her grandchildren, my uncle Willis's daughters. But she is the one that told this story, and it is one of my favorite stories. It starts off with her dad, Doc Wilkerson, who was what they called a root doctor. He today would have been called a fortune teller or something like that. People came from all over to see her dad, all over North Florida and Georgia, to see her dad uh, for things like if they've lost something, he would somehow be able to tell them where to look to find it. He could mix up roots and herbs and making tea to help you get over sicknesses and things like that. He was very popular, and he was well known, and people liked him and went to him for things like that. So in Maxville, there was an old woman who had about five kids, and the kids started getting sick. Her husband had died, and her kids started getting sick, and she tried everything that she could to help them, and nothing would help them. So she called on Doc Wilkerson to come and see if there was anything that he could do. And he made some willow bark tea for them and everything, and they continued to get sicker and sicker. And there wasn't anything that he seemed to be able to do. But he had a friend, a guy named Living Jones, that lived in a town called Laude, about 10 miles away from Maxville. And he sent word for Living Jones to come and see if there was anything that he could do. Living Jones was a root doctor himself, a fortune teller that was supposedly much more powerful than my grandfather was. Living Jones, and during this period of time in history, they rode horses. So Living Jones rides into Maxville on his horse, and he rides up to where the woman with the kids, with the children that are getting sicker at, and he looks over at her house, and he doesn't get off his horse, but he turns the horse around and he goes next door across the road. And there's a woman that lives there whose name was Sarah, and he rode his horse up to the fence that went around her house, and he took a walking stick that he carried with him on his horse, and he pounded on the fence. and he rapped on the fence and he called out, Sarah, Sarah, come here. I want to talk to you. And Sarah, the old woman that lived in the house, she went to the door and she leaned out the door. And to the surprise of everybody watching, he pointed his finger at Sarah and he said, Sarah, if any of those children die across the street, if any of your neighbor's children dies, he says, I'm going to kill you. He turned his horse and he rode off down the street and back to his house. Well, the neighbors were horrified. They didn't know what to do. But a few days later, one of the children got really, really sick and passed away. So Living Jones rode up to Sarah's house and he got off his horse and he walked over to a tree in her yard and he started carving on the tree. He sat there with his knife and he carved on the tree and he carved on the tree. And everybody in the neighborhood has come out to watch what Living Jones is doing. And Living Jones carves the figure of a woman on the trunk of the tree. After he gets the carving done and he's looking at it and it looks good, he blows the shavings off of it. He walks back to his horse and he gets a nail out of his saddlebag and a hammer. And he goes back to the figure that he drew on the tree, and right in the center of her forehead, he put the nail and he hit it one time with the hammer. And he turns and gets on his horse and he rides off. All this time, Sarah is leaning out of her door watching him do this. And all the neighbors that lived around in Maxfield were watching him do it. Living Jones never says a word. He just gets on his horse and he rides off. Every day at sundown, Living Jones would come riding back up to Sarah's house. He would get off his horse. He would walk over to the tree. He would take a hammer and he would hit the nail on the head one time. This went on for months. Eventually, Living Jones took the hammer. He leaned back and he hit it, and the head of the hammer, the end of the nail, touched the forehead of the figure that he had carved on the tree. Sarah, leaning out of her door, watching all of this, fell over dead. As soon as the head of the nail touched the forehead of the figure on the tree, Sarah fell out on the porch, dead. Now, this is Florida, and they're poor people. They don't have people to funeral homes to take the body to. So the women take Sarah and take her back in the house and lay her on the kitchen table, and they clean her body up and they put on a new dress and get her ready for burial. A couple of the men build a coffin and they take the coffin to Sarah's house, and the next morning they put Sarah in the coffin and they take and nail the coffin shut, the top of the coffin shut. They're going to take Sarah to Clay Hill Cemetery and they're going to bury her. Clay Hill Cemetery is a cemetery near Maxville, 3 or 4 miles away. So they've got a cart to put the coffin on, and they're going to take it there, and they got a preacher that's going to say a few words, and they're going to bury Sarah. when they get ready to take her coffin to the cart, 6 men, 3 on one side of the coffin, 3 on the other, try to pick the coffin up, and they can't budge it. The coffin will not come off of the porch of Sarah's house. It won't move. And these are 3 strong farm men that are used to lifting heavy bags of feed every day. They can't move this coffin. And Living Jones, who showed up for the funeral, is leaning over against the tree where he carved her picture at, and he's just laughing. And he says, "Boys, boys," he says, "open up the top of the casket and let the black cat out, and you'll be able to bury Sarah." Well, the men look around. They don't really know what to think, but one of them goes and gets a crowbar, and they stick the crowbar in the top of the casket, and they're trying to work the nails loose, and it's cracking and cracking. They're trying to get the top of the coffin up, and the coffin, they get it open about like that, and they get the crowbar in there and they work it up just a little bit more, and pretty soon it gets open about like that. It gets, the nails are creaking, it's opening up higher and higher. Bam! A black cat jumps out of the coffin. A black cat had been inside of the coffin. The black cat hops out, and he's baring his teeth and hissing and going back and forth across the porch. He backs up against the side of the house. He's and Living Jones takes his walking stick and he walks over toward the cat. He says, "Get out of here, devil." And the black cat turns and screams and runs off into the bushes. Living Jones says, "Boys, hammer the top on the casket back down and take Sarah to the graveyard. You'll be able to pick her casket up now and bury her." So they nailed the top down on the casket. They picked the casket up, easy as pie, because Sarah wasn't a big woman. And they carried her on to the cart, and they drove her to the cemetery, and they buried her in the cemetery. Now, Sarah is buried in Clay Hill Cemetery near Maxville, Florida. She's buried back in the southeast corner, because I've been there at night to watch and see where her grave is. And if you'll go there on a moonlight night at night, you'll be able to see Sarah's grave and know that it's Sarah's grave, because the cats will come out of the bushes and they'll circle around Sarah's grave. That's the end of the History Scary Stories. We'll have other stories for you later on this year, different kinds. Hope you enjoyed them. Seems different doing it on a camera.